welcome back to the conversation stage, where we're asking big, important, and sometimes difficult questions about the direction of AI. For our penultimate session of the day, we're going global in our conversation. Behind our AI-powered technology lies an invisible workforce. Thousands of ghost workers carry out tasks such as cleaning, labeling data, sometimes for as little as £2 an hour, all recruited via crowdsourcing platforms. With increasing concerns about exploitation, is this the digital equivalent of fashion sweatshops? Our panel will consider whether AI is contributing to inequality and whether those gaps are rooted in gender, race, and class. I'm really pleased to introduce the chair of this panel discussion, a colleague whose work I admire greatly, Madhumita Murgia, who is technology correspondent of the FT, Financial Times. And now it's over to you, Madhu.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you all today, to see you all virtually. I'm hoping we also have our in-person panelist with us, Callum, although I can't quite see him, so hopefully he will appear from somewhere very quickly. Hello Callum.
Hi guys.
Thank you all for joining us today. This is something that I've been writing about for a while and learning about, and as Anjana introduced, this invisible workforce that one of our panelists, Sid, has christened ghost workers. For me, the amazing thing is how diverse and global this population is. Many of them working in parts of the world, the global south and the developing world, that we wouldn't expect, and are helping to train the AI systems of some of the biggest technology companies in the world, many based in Silicon Valley, many that we know and we recognize, but also all sorts of other large organizations that use AI in their work, from car companies to healthcare, and logistics and manufacturing, energy and climate. All of these companies have now become infused with AI in terms of the products and services that they produce. And this workforce, this global workforce, many of whom are vulnerable populations, women, those with other responsibilities who may not be able to do traditional 9-to-5 work, have been drawn into these jobs. So I think this is a really fascinating pocket of the AI workforce that doesn't ever get seen or discussed as much as the sort of engineering talent. And so I want our panelists today to introduce themselves, and as they do so, to also tell us a little bit about the perspective and their experience that they bring to this topic that we're discussing today of human workers and AI systems. Maybe we can start with Wendy and go to Sid, and then Callum. You can round us out.
Thank you, Meta. It's a pleasure to be here. Really glad to be able to talk about this important topic. So thank you for having me. Just by way of introduction, my name is Wendy Gonzalez. I'm the CEO of Asama. We are a certified B Corp, and we have a social mission that was founded on the belief that talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. And what that really means is that people in underserved communities face the greatest barriers to employment, whether it be not being able to afford to go to university or having no network or access to jobs. Our focus at Asama is about getting women and youth connected to the digital economy by purposely hiring based off of impact criteria. So we do have a criteria that we hire at least 50% women. The work we do as a company is to provide a scalable AI data pipeline. So we have a platform as well as humans in the loop, so our annotators who help annotate or quality assure our machine-driven annotations that come from our platform. A little bit more about our model. Our model is that we are a bridge employer providing training and first-time formal employment. So our annotators are not the crowd or crowd workers. They are salaried employees with the benefits versus being paid by the task.
Yeah.
These are, to speak to sort of the perspective on this particular topic, these are our teammates that are our employees that we care for. It's people like Prudence, Peter and Bridget. I'll just give a little story here to give just kind of a quick view on sort of the team. I met Bridget the first time I went to Kenya in 2015 in June and helped run our AI 101 training class. I was performing mock interviews in a community center in the Kibera slums. Bridget was so shy that she could basically only stay at her shoes during the mock interview. She joined SOM, and a few months later, I saw her. She was vibrant. She was asking me how I was doing. A year later, she was promoted to team lead. Not too long after that, she became a cultural ambassador for SAMA. And last year, she actually left to become a manager at another Kenyan call center. So this is what our objective is to create positive outcomes. From the standpoint of humans in the loop, I believe they're a critical part of making AI both effective and representative, and they will be for the for the coming decades. And in terms of a perspective on, how do we treat annotators, what is the best way to do it, and this notion of ghost working, I feel very strongly that that not only are humans in the loop critical, but that we need to have salaried employment. With salaried employment, that means that not only are there wages, living wages above minimum wage, benefits to be able to provide to people. Beyond that, you can focus on actually quality and accuracy versus cranking out tasks and productivity. It's been, I think, well understood that when you incentivize based off of task production, that not only could you sort of be potentially not paying people the right wages, but beyond that, you're incentivizing for productivity and what you think the right answer is, which could create bias in itself. And so having an integrated workforce and employees means that there's a feedback loop, and you can actually both incentivize on quality, you can incentivize on removing bias, and I think it's a critical part of actually having accurate and representative AI. So hopefully that gives a little bit of sense of what SOM is about and some of our perspectives on kind of annotations in human context.
Thanks, Wendy. That's given us a lot of food for thought. And I do want to come back to you to talk a little bit more about, as we said, putting a face to that, your workforce, and telling us a little bit more about who they are, and so on. But thank you for the intro. Sid, can you tell us a little bit about your expertise and your perspective?
Sure. First of all, to those in the audience, those online, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you all today. Much of what I'm going to talk about today comes from the book Ghost Work, which I co-authored with Mary Gray, my colleague here at Microsoft Research. And the purpose of this book was to shed light on the human labor that powers much of modern AI systems. And the idea is that there's basically three things that power the AI revolution that we're now in the midst of. The first was widely available computational power. The second was widely available data sets. And then the third was this human labor workforce that labeled these data sets, trained these algorithms so that they would work in the real world. A quote from our book is that Mechanical Turk workers are the unsung heroes of the AI revolution. And my perspective is the following. It's going to mesh very well with Wendy's, I would imagine. My perspective is very simple. If you think about a lot of the discussion around AI, there's all this discussion of, will we get to this dystopian world where AI takes all of our jobs and we're all on the streets hungry? Or utopian world where AI takes all our jobs and we're laying on the beach pursuing creative interests. And my thought is, let's put that on the side for a minute. Neither of those, first of all, we're not powerless to control those two outcomes. We can pick which outcome we get to. A. B, none of those outcomes are going to happen in my lifetime, and I would argue they're not going to happen in my son's lifetime. So let's focus on the here and now. Let's focus on how we're treating the workers that power modern AI systems now, so that wherever we get to with intentionality, and we're proud of how we treated the humans that got us there. So let's focus on the here and now and the humans that are powering these systems here and now. A little bit about me and my perspective. Thanks, Madhu.
Sorry, rookie error.
Yeah.
Callum, do come in and tell us about your perspective and your work.
Sure. Well, my introduction to thinking about the gig economy, thinking about platforms, thinking about the ways in which AI was changing work was primarily as a worker. After I finished my undergraduate, I ended up working for Deliveroo for a period of time. That experience went on to become the basis of the book that I published as Writing for Deliveroo. And that book tells a story really of what platform capitalism, as Nick Sercek has called it, is like for the people on the front lines of it. And whilst that's more of a study of kind of gig work classically, so food delivery work, I think it highlights a lot of problems with a lot of salience to the discussion we're going to have here today. I mean, you're talking about low wages, unsafe conditions, a lack of any kind of recognised bargaining relationship between capital or labour, and really an intensification of a lot of these dynamics that we would classically ascribe to sweatshops or factories in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, the dark satanic mills, those exact same social dynamics kind of reoccurring now. Since I worked at Deliveroo, I've done a doctorate. I'm now a postdoctoral fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, and my work now really focuses on, again, still that interface between technology and society. And I think it's interesting to hear other panelists' contributions on this. Really, one of the major salient things to bear in mind is AI is not that special, right? When we're thinking about the relationship between technology and work, we have many, many, many precedents for the introduction of technology like this to the workplace. And whilst none may be identical in their exact capacities, there are lots of ways that people have been thinking about this. You know, Andrew Adam Smith, Karl Marx, these guys were thinking about this stuff generations and generations ago. So there's a lot for us to think about and think about those lineages, and many of the questions that I think we'll ask today are fundamentally about the form of society we live in, not specific to AI, but more generally about how the social relations between labour and capital in particular are organised. My work now is, as I said, more focused on AI. I'm particularly working with the Global Partnership on AI on a project around the future of AI ethics with specific relevance to the workplace. And so I think, for me, I'm interested in kind of three audiences of workers, right? I'm interested in the kind of workers that I was, platform workers who are geographically tethered to a specific place, you know, who are doing the lunch run to offices in London, who are doing taxi rides to and from airports. I'm interested in workers in the wider economy who are increasingly being managed by algorithms. So that may be, you know, someone working in an Amazon warehouse who formerly they're just a warehouse operative, but their work is increasingly being remodeled by the use of AI technology. And then finally, particularly interested in these workers who actually do, you know, from whom a lot of the intelligence of AI derives, right? The Turkers, the people who do the data labeling, who do some of the content moderation, who make these kind of decisions and are swept up in the global scope of AI's development without necessarily having any of the rewards that have come from that in places like Silicon Valley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think actually that's a good kind of segue to talk about who these workers are and what are the jobs that they're doing. We've made a lot of allusions, and possibly our audience also is aware a little bit about what you know, work is needed in order to label data to train machine learning algorithms and so on. But I think we have a wealth of experience, particularly between Sid and Wendy, of the type of tasks, the types of companies, and you know, more detail around wages. You know, we've mentioned low wages, we've mentioned labor conditions. So why don't we start, Sid? Could you give us a little bit of a flavor? You know, you've studied this platform for over half a decade, one particular one, Mechanical Turk, but others around it. And could you start by telling us a little bit about what are the jobs that these people have been doing? How has that evolved? And a little bit around the, you know, the labor conditions and the wages that you've seen over the time that you've been studying it. And then we can go to Wendy to talk about Sama.
Sure. Right. So it's really interesting. I started working on Mechanical Turk in 2010, before it was cool. And I remember there was a sea change right around 2012. Before 2012, I had to explain to everyone what it was, how it worked. And then after 2012, if I tried to do that, everyone was like, yeah, I know what that is. Keep going. So it was really interesting. So how that progressed. Okay. So your question was about the jobs the workers do and how that's evolved. Okay.
Yeah, and particularly in relation to AI, I should say, because I know they do a whole range of other tasks.
So here's the way we sort of talk. So typical tasks on Mechanical Turk, just for people who are not familiar with it, things like image labeling, audio transcription, video labeling, translation tasks, video captioning, these kinds of tasks, things that can be easily parallelizable. You know, you take this chunk of video, I take that chunk of video, we can stitch our work together, things like that. Things that can be done sort of in bulk. You know, here's a whole video, here's a whole stack of videos, here's a whole stack of images. Get that, you know, people can read the instructions, understand them once, churn through the work. How have these jobs changed? So in the book, we talk about, in Ghost Work, we talk about this notion, we call it the paradox of automation's last mile. So here's what we mean. At any given moment, it's not a new idea. At any given moment, there's a set of problems computers can solve. By definition, that means there's a set of problems outside that you need humans to solve. Okay, fine. Then there's an innovation. The set of problems that machines can solve grows. And then there's a new frontier of problems that we want solved that we need humans to solve. And that set grows and grows. And then every so often after an innovation, there's a new frontier of problems we need to solve. And so I don't have the sort of specific data to show that, the longitudinal data over 10, 15 years of MTurk use to show that, but that's generally what you can kind of see. As machines get better and better solving problems, the old problems that Turkers were solving kind of fade away and new ones kind of come along. As an example, image labeling, thanks to ImageNet, thanks to deep learning revolution, that problem we've made a ton of progress on. So now you're starting to see other problems like video recognition or things like there's two objects in this image. What are their relationship to each other? Things like that. That's one thing that's changed. One thing that hasn't changed terribly much is how the workers do the work, and the platforms themselves haven't changed like night and day. Yes, there's been incremental improvements. Yes, there's been additions of this feature, that kind of thing. But there's been no real sea change as far as I can tell as to how the work is done. Exception, people like Sama really taking a holistic view. I want to put them on the side. Yeah, in this space, haven't seen a ton of change. And then finally, one of the studies I recently did about this was, if you look at MTurk workers, we did a study where we showed they make on the average about $4 an hour in the US for US dollars an hour. But if you take into account all their transaction costs, how much time they spend looking for work, how much time they spend understanding work, how much time they spend chasing down people who haven't paid them yet, their pay rate gets cut by a third. So the transaction costs here are real. So that's another point I want to make. But does you answer your question? I'll pass it on now to
And just one quick add question to that. Do we have a sense of how large this workforce is? Is there any estimation of how many people are involved in this, both through the through gig work as well as in employment by companies like Sama?
So platforms generally, again, excluding Sama and platforms like that, Amazon just won't ever give us that number, period. So that's kind of not a fruitful way forward. Various academic studies have shown that in a month, you could probably hope to get about 10,000 very active workers in a month. Other same studies show that in about 6 months, 50% of the population churns. So 50% of the population will be new, 50% will be old. And you might think that's a little weird. The way I think about it is this. People fade in and fade out of these markets as their lives change, as their economic circumstances change, as the constraints of their lives change. So for example, say, my mom is sick and I need to take care of her. I might fade out of this market for a little bit. She gets better, I fade back in. And so that's one of the many reasons behind this churn. So yeah, hard numbers are hard to come by.
Okay, no, that helps. So quite a precarious population with kind of changing situations. Wendy, tell us about your workforce at Sama. It's because obviously it's quite different to the mechanical Turk model, as you mentioned. Their employees, they're full-time, they're paid wages. Tell us, who they are, what sort of skills and backgrounds do they come with, and a little bit about how the work that they do, of course, at Sama. And talk us through the evolution of that work and the time that you've seen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, I agree, Sid, the numbers are hard to come by. We've seen competitors who leverage a crowd who claim to have millions of people in the crowd that are registered, but what does that really mean, right? There could be turnover substantially, so it's quite hard to tell. A little bit about the employees that we have at Sama. So our social mission is to focus on breaking down barriers to employment. It's incredibly difficult to get access to a job. So we work within, we originally started working with kind of community NGOs. We've now built a little bit more of a reputation. So we have wait lists of people who can sign up for our training. One of the key differences I would say in this model is that when you're exactly how Sid described it, you go on Mechanical Turk, you read a series of instructions. Like that's your guideline for how you were supposed to sort of execute your task. one of the critical differences in having an employee or a vertically integrated workforce is you can actually train people. And so we have an AI 101 training, which starts with, everything from basic mousing skills and, and typing and sort of how to navigate a monitor to the concepts of AI. And then when people join Sama, we have specific platform training as well as kind of next level training, which includes, how to leverage the tools and whatnot. As well as the context for what the teams are doing. So, in doing something like object detection, the purpose is not just to identify and outline a particular car. You're trying to, teach the car how to drive, right? So we do a lot of that kind of contextual training. In terms of what's really changed over the course of the years, it's changed a ton. So if I use a self-driving car, so we work in automotive, AR, VR, retail for things like digital search, surgical robots, things of that nature. If I take the self-driving car example, 7 years ago when I joined Sama, yes, there were more questions like, is there a car in this picture? How many cars are in this picture? And let's do the outline. Now we are at a stage based on exactly what Sid was sharing earlier. We are doing 3D point cloud and LiDAR. And that's really difficult to do with no context. So as somebody who's looking at a screen, you're trying to look at point cloud dots that aren't like obviously two-dimensional images and needing to track those with a certain level of accuracy to make sure that you're actually following the same car. To do that without any context, without any kind of training and understanding of how to leverage the tools would be pretty difficult. So that is a big part of what we do, and we have trainers and kind of feedback loop on real time so that we can say, hey, here's the context of what you're doing. Here's a different business rule that you might want to try to improve the workflow. A little bit about the people. We, of course, these are employees. So everybody comes in, we know who they are, they're teammates. So I gave the example of Bridget. I'll give another example of Prudence, who we still chat on a regular basis, but she comes from Kibera slums. So that is one of the largest slums in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's based in Nairobi. And through the community outreach, she signed up for the training and joined Sama. What's typical, because of our social mission, is we focus on providing opportunities to people in underemployed situations. So most people are in the informal economy. By informal economy, that could mean like I'm making snacks and I'm selling them by the side of the road. I am selling secondhand clothing. So that's a pretty typical position. Then they come in, the objective is to come into the formal economy, which is to provide digital skills so that once you leave Sama, so we're a bridge employer. The intention is not to be an annotator, for the rest of your life. It's to build soft skills and technical skills to then go and do things like what Bridget did, which is move into project management and leave to another company. That's a positive outcome for us.
So Wendy, when you say that the work has changed, has that meant that the skill set has had to change, and also has the pay evolved over the 7 years? And what do you pay people? What are the specifically the benefits and pay that they would get that they don't if they're doing this work on mechanical turk?
Yeah, absolutely. So yearly we do what we call a living wage audit. And so every country has minimum wages as well as third parties identify living wages. And so we leverage third parties like Trading Economics. We do our own kind of food basket analysis based off of the Anchor methodology. And then of course we keep track of minimum wage. And so the context, I think Sid gave some context in the in the US market. So for example, in the Kenyan market, minimum wage is 13,700 shillings. And so we pay on average 25,000 shillings as an example. So our focus to be at that stage, which is living wage. In terms of benefits, it's medical, dental, vision, psychological. We do pension plans. The goal is to create an environment where there's not a, it's a very different model. So people aren't seeking out their tasks and, kind of doing the overhead, if you will, that Sid was talking about. We engage with clients, the work is identified, and then we train specifically and people get engaged on projects. And when those particular projects end, they move on to something else.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to pause here for a second to say, we didn't mention at the beginning, but we will take questions from the audience and we'll try and answer as many of them as we can in the last 15 minutes. So if you, I think you should all have access to Slido, and if you can just put your questions through and send them through to us, we'll make sure to get to them if you have any at the end of this. So going back, so Wendy, thank you for kind of explaining the labor conditions and some of the work that your employees are doing. I want to go to Callum now to ask a little bit about, to go back to the macro question. Callum, you studied class conflict in particular when you were, working as a delivery worker, and in the book that you subsequently wrote, and also the working conditions. Do you see those same types of hierarchies and power asymmetries being reproduced in this type of work when you work for large AI companies and you're given a task through, usually through a middleman? And can you talk us through a little bit what that looks like, those hierarchies, or the sort of difference in power?
Yeah, for sure. Well, yes, fundamentally, these are being reproduced. I think we can see very clearly a platform like Mechanical Turk is a good example, right? You have a task issuer, you have the platform, and then you have the worker. The task issuer can put out these like very small segments of jobs. Workers then work on them. They compete to get the job in the first place. They may not be paid if they complete the task. When they are paid, they're paid very low wages. They have very little understanding or control about how that work is being used. So, for instance, there are some crowd workers all over the world who have worked on facial recognition that's then being used by, for example, the LAPD to conduct racist policing in the US. Or if you look at Google, the Project Maven drone footage identification, that was farmed out to click workers who then had to, identify objects from drone footage that was fed back into the US military. So fundamentally, there are all sorts of different vectors through which we can see this power imbalance. One that I think is particularly striking and will be familiar to all of us is pay. A meta-analysis shows that workers on these platforms are generally earning around $3. I think the exact number is $3.24 an hour. Now, if you consider unpaid waiting time, which is a huge part of the job, and I think as Sid said, can reduce wages by about a third, we're talking about people being paid around $2 an hour. Now, depending on where they're based in the global economy, workers in the global south will obviously get much more purchasing power from a wage of approximately $2 an hour than workers in the global north. That will make a very significant difference. And I think one of the really important ways to think through this workforce and the stratification of this workforce is geography, as well as the ones that we're more familiar with using in an in-person work environment. But really, you're talking about the big tech monopolies run these platforms, right? Your Amazon that runs Amazon Web Services, obviously. They are putting to work a huge, generally underpaid workforce of highly precarious workers with no access to sick pay, no access to holiday pay, no trade union representation, to do the work that then kind of creates and enables their commodity production more generally. They're harvesting data from that work that then allows them to do more complex things with their own AI, and they're also making profit through other people putting tasks through the platform. So clearly in that context, there's a huge dissymmetry between capital and labour. It's just as pronounced, if not more pronounced, than we would see in food delivery, ride-hailing, any of these other sectors that we consider more classically part of the platform economy. So I'd say when we look at the global supply chain that enables AI, who's doing the work that enables the developments like AlexNet, that stuff that happened in 2012 that was so revelatory, well, that supply chain is beset by all the problems that are common to really a capitalist labour. And there's no way of avoiding the wider social issues that emerge in other contexts. If you're looking at the social issues that emerge in Walmart around benefits, around wages, those same things are emerging in cloud work platforms. And I think it's particularly illustrative, or one of the particular points of interest here is around what workers can do in response, right? Like how have workers self-organised? So at Deliveroo, workers have over and over again, there's some really fascinating work on this from colleagues at Leeds, mobilised in the platform economy to improve their wages and conditions. So we've seen strike after strike after strike. At the moment in the UK, there's a strike into its 90th odd day against a platform called Stuart over a 24% wage cut. Now, is there an example like this in cloud work? No, there isn't exactly anything like that. There's the example that people like Lily Irani have done lots of good work on of Turkopticon, which is a design plugin which allows workers to kind of rate their task issuer on Mechanical Turk. But in general, we haven't seen collective resistance. So there is a very strong power dynamic. In general, that isn't being contested at the moment because of the kind of unique organizational difficulties involved in being part of that globally distributed crowd. I mean, if you imagine as a worker, you have no capacity necessarily to talk directly to other workers on your platform. You don't necessarily, if you took some kind of industrial action, the ability to bring in substitute labour would be very easy. There's a lot of complexities here that people are really struggling to deal with. No trade union, as far as I'm aware, has made any kind of progress with these platforms at all. So really, it's a very difficult problem. And as someone with a lot of sympathy for workers facing these kind of issues, it's a difficult situation where, with the exception of some employers who are obviously taking steps like Sama are to improve conditions, it's hard to see a clear path for improvement because this power dynamic is just quite so profound at the moment.
We can move toward at the end of this discussion to talk a little bit about solutions. But Sid, maybe you can jump in here because you've also looked at workers in India, right? Or at least in ghost work. And so, I mean, I wonder whether you can, also add your perspective on whether you think this work is contributing to inequality, whether the companies giving the work enjoy more power and the workers doing the work are disempowered and are losing out in some way. Can you kind of outline what that looks like in an Indian context versus a Western one?
Sure. Before I do that, I just want to touch on 2 quick points. Wendy made a very interesting point about, a lot of platforms say they have millions of workers, or they advertise however many registered workers they have. One thing you see on the internet time and time again, in basically every online community, if there's N people that have registered, it's like 10% of N are the active users. You see that on like Wikipedia, and you see that everywhere. So when companies say they have that many workers, I always mentally just take 10% of it and say, that's actually how many they have. That's one thing. Second thing, Callum mentioned these hierarchies and asymmetries. I'd love to get back to that. It's a super, super interesting point. I've done follow-up work on that. Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Indian context here. Yeah. So we studied workers in the US and we studied workers in India. And there's a couple of things going on here. Is it contributing to inequality? It's a tough question. Let me explain why. For example, I'll give you a few anecdotes, a few vignettes from our book. One vignette, so all the names in our book are anonymized, so they're not the person's real name. But one was a gentleman who was he was paralyzed from the waist down, so he couldn't work outside the home. But from the waist up, mentally, physically, everything working perfectly. So he did work on mechanical work, on Mechanical Turk, so he could provide for his family. That's one example. Second example was this woman. She was a young woman in a village. I believe it was outside Hyderabad, if I remember right. And she lived in a place and in a context where, when she was a kid, educating girls was not a default. But her dad insisted on she getting an education. And she did. And she did work on Mechanical Turk. And not only that, she trained people in her village to do work on Mechanical Turk. And a cute little sub-anecdote here was the postman would always come and give her checks. And was like, what is this? Why do I keep giving you these same envelopes from the same place? And then I think she even trained the postman, if I remember it. And anyway, she ended up opening a school for girls in her village with this money in her father's name. So the point I'm making here is, and then there's a third example was, women in the southern India, it might have been culturally looked down upon, let's say, to work outside the home. Maybe they were Muslim, maybe they're this religion, that religion. They were doing this work to contribute to their households. So the point I'm making is, it's a much more complicated story than I can just say, yes, it contributes to inequality, or no, it doesn't. I really have a hard time putting it in those binary terms. The point I'm making here is, broadening out one step. These people are resourceful. They're using this work to wrap around the constraints of their lives, to fit into the constraints of their lives. They're gritty, they're creative. If I asked half the population of this audience right now, to pay for their dinner with money they made on the internet today, half of them would go hungry, and the other half would only be able to afford McDonald's. So, I mean, these people, but these people are really providing for their entire families this way. So it's something I don't want to, you know, I just want to hold them up. I want to hold up their grit. I want to hold up their creativity and hold up their resourcefulness as something that's to be admired.
Thank you. Wendy, I think you can come in there because, you know, the point of this panel is to be as global as possible. And actually, you know, I said we do questions at the end, but there's a question here which kind of ties into what we're talking about, where someone's asked an anonymous question. We may dislike the undercutting of workers in the rich world, but how beneficial is this ghost work for workers in poor or remote places who have internet? So obviously this is kind of the point of Summer. And I do want you to talk, you know, about whether you think it is contributing to inequality or whether you think you're actually solving them through the work you're doing. But then I will come back to this question because I want to push beyond the very obvious binary of, you know, rich places versus poor places and why some people deserve less than others just because they have less, which is a bit complicated, but I'll come back to that question. But, you know, if you can contextualize for us whether you think you're actually, you know, solving inequality problems or whether you do see this contributing in any way or creating new types of inequalities.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So I'll answer in a couple of parts. I mean, first, I mean, yes, that's our entire objective, is to basically bring a group of people who might miss sort of the digital economy into the digital economy. Like that's the purpose of this, is that you've got all this incredible, you know, sort of talent and human capital. And the goal of SOM is to actually create market demanded skill sets. So our primary purpose is not, you know, to make lifelong, you know, gig workers and annotators. It's actually to build technical skill sets to allow people to get other jobs. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a bridge employer. And so one of the things that we do at SAMA is we do a significant amount of data analysis. We actually have development economists that are on staff that actually help us track and survey this data. And one of the things we did, this is actually published in May of 2021 with MIT and Poverty Action Labs. They're you know, a world-class think tank on poverty and poverty alleviation solutions. And we wanted to check ourselves because that's the entire purpose, Madhu, is to say, hey, is this intervention, if you will, is it going in the right direction? You know, is it doing what we intended it to do? So we did a 3-year longitudinal study, or I should say MIT facilitated this. And basically what we were tracking is, okay, if you get trained and hired by SAMA, does it make a difference in your actual income and your employment, you know, your employability, basically? And tracking that over 3 years. So we had a control group that did not get training or get hired, but are from the same demographic we would typically hire in. So they applied for the training. Those who received the training but did not get hired, and those who got the traditional SAMA intervention, which is training and hire. And the thing that was most significant that we found is overall there was a statistically significant increase for both men and women in terms of both employment and wages. But in particular, so this is 3 years later and thousands of people in the study, women in particular had 3 times higher employment and 3 times higher wages. And they will have gone through the intervention and left. So we did this statistical analysis specifically to answer that question, which is, you know, our purpose is not necessarily annotation specifically, it's building the technical skill sets. And what we find from our exit interviews, so we continue to interview people after they have left SAMA, is that the critical things in terms of getting additional jobs are, you need to have some, you know, sort of ICT skills, right? Meaning, can you operate a computer? So a big part of it is literally mousing, typing, and being able to navigate around a computer. It is soft skills, in terms of like issues resolution and communication and working in the formal workplace, which is a first for the vast majority of our workforce. And what's very interesting is that for at least for our team, 50%, over 50%, roughly 56, go on to other jobs in ICT. So that might be working at one example is Martha. She started as an agent, doing annotations on our platform, went to become a team lead. Now she is a manager at a travel agency, and she's leveraging her computer skills. So yes, I believe this is the right thing to do. That's what our intention is to continue to build skill sets. And one of the things that we're very focused on is this is not intended to be sort of a forever position. So we provide access to platforms like, plural sites and others to provide continuous training and help build CVs to eventually move on to other high-paying jobs or to go back to university. So that's the intention, and we've seen through both impact audits and the RCT that we're moving in the right direction, and we want to continue to focus on developing higher level skills so that people can move on to other jobs. So that's one perspective. In terms of the inequality between sort of the global north and the global south, I think there is an important point made by Callum around sort of purchasing power. So the way that we look at it is, I mean, everywhere in the world is different. What a cup of coffee costs in Delhi is going to look very different than what it costs in Nairobi or Gulu, Uganda, or beyond, or at your local Starbucks, in the Bay Area. And so what we try to focus on is really how do we ensure sort of purchasing power for the local economies, and that is the way that we're addressing it now. But I think there's a really important point that I think it's an incredibly important point is that when you're in this sort of large global economy on these platforms, it doesn't take that into account. So one of the things that was really interesting is we actually at Sama we've run various programs in the past, and one of the programs that we ran in the past was a gig working one to figure out to answer kind of the question that Sid was answering, which is full-time work may not be an option for everybody. What if you've got kids to take care of at home? Even if we offer daycare, maybe you don't want to leave your children with daycare. That was like one of the challenges we found when we were launching our centers. So how do you create this opportunity? But the challenge we found in particular with our kind of with the impact population, which is searching for people who didn't necessarily have skill sets, and then trying to provide kind of like an agency overhead. What I mean by that is one of the hardest things, and I think Sid said it really well, which is to be a gig worker, you have to be an entrepreneur. You've got to go out, you got to search for the jobs, you got to be qualified. And in the digital world, if you don't do a good job, you'll get 1 star or 0 stars. And then your ability to get another job is like really hard. And so when we launched our kind of freelancing as an option, what we found it was really hard if people didn't have existing skills. And we had an entire team of people who spent searching for jobs that were applicable, doing quality assurance. And we found it was like actually really difficult for us to get many jobs, because having a manager or a trainer on site to help with that, to get jobs that only paid a certain amount, we were paying to do the work effectively. And so I'm not saying that is the case for everybody, but I do think that there is a challenge. And when you're in sort of a global economy, if you're, for example, trying to do design work, we tried to do this in the US where we're like, okay, to pay a living wage, if you're living in Arkansas, you need to be paid about $15 an hour. That's just what it's going to take. So then it was like, okay, well, now what kind of jobs can we do for $20 an hour just to cover the cost of the computer space and the computers? And we were like, okay, well, the only thing we can do is do social media, like influencing. Maybe that's something we can train people on. It was so hard to do with people who didn't have training beforehand that we ended up giving back the grant money for that particular, because it was so difficult to find for sort of people who didn't have the specific skills to get them into that economy in a fair way without a lot of overhead and intervention. That is just my experience.
I guess we're the sort of what I'm getting from between you and Callum and Sid is that the gig work has much fewer, as I think we're all aware, protections, wages are more of an issue, and much more kind of a precarious population. And then possibly for the global South model, at least, the full-time wage or full-time working is much more beneficial, which kind of answers our question from the audience as well. When you are in somewhere that you don't have access to work, and maybe can't access education in the same way, then this type of work is helping to bring people into the formal workforce, as you said, Wendy. But I guess I want to go a little bit further into that. So you mentioned this right at the beginning, this is where we are today. These workers exist today. They're doing jobs today. So yes, great that you've brought them to this point, and then I'll bring, in aggregate, they have better opportunities. But the question remains, I think, of, are they currently being treated well enough? regardless of whether they live in a poorer place and their coffee costs less, and etc. You know, we've looked at the differences between, we know the differences between the Bay Area, London, Nairobi, and, you know, Delhi, but still they're doing the same work, right? So they and also to put into perspective, you know, who are your clients? Some of literally the most valuable companies in the world, right? So recent story said, you know, Facebook was one of your clients, for example, trillion dollar companies. You know, I don't know about whether specifically this is true for you, but, you know, Google takes advantage of this type of data labeling work, Walmart, you know, some of really the world's biggest companies. And ultimately they're looking for the cheapest prices for their work to be done at scale. So yes, you're a B Corp, but this is ultimately also affordable work for, you know, companies that need it and have a lot of money. So the question is, do the protections need to be better? Do we see a problem in how things work today, even in full-time work at places like Summer? Are the wages too low compared to people doing the same work in London or in New Orleans or in San Francisco? And, you know, should they be given better, more power and more say in the work that they do? And, you know, this is something for Wendy, of course, but also, you know, Callum, feel free to jump in and said, and not only to talk about it in the gig work context, but really in the context of, you know, even if you have full-time benefits and even if you live in the developing world.
And I think you're bringing up a great point. I mean, this is a global workforce, and I mean, it's interesting, even in our sort of situation, being an employer versus a crowd. I mean, there's always going to be a competitor who's sort of willing to do it for less, right? You know, like that is a legitimate point of being able to do work at scale from a cost perspective. One of the things that we've, I think Callum is part of the PAI as well. So we do work with a partnership for AI also, and we provided some guidance on sort of social impact criteria for the ethical hiring of people. And I think that there are a few ways to address this, but the demand, your point on the demand side is a good one, which is why there needs to be brought sort of visibility into standards. And so one of the things that we're big fans of is measuring and communicating. So, you know, the reports that we have on our impact and sort of making that visible is something that we do on a quarterly basis. What can we do to encourage companies? Very similar to like, at one point in time, we were working with a large partnership. I'm sad to say this did not come to fruition, but it was a platform that was focusing on things like procurement. And some of those platforms today help identify, you know, companies that, for example, deal with conflict minerals, right? So it's very clearly visible, and, you know, procurement leaders can take a look at that and say, hey, I only want to do business with these companies that do not engage in these kinds of practices. So I think that is part of it, is being able to create standards and criteria for how the purchasing works, because it's the buyers who have that power. You know, I mean, they are the ones who can make the choices as to, I want to take this approach, where it's like, I mean, because I hear this often. It's like, okay, well, great, you know, we love the quality of your, you know, your full-time employment, but you're not the cheapest. So what do we do about that? And so bringing visibility into decision-making criteria, I think is really important, because that's how the behaviors begin to change.
And actually, we have a question from the audience which ties in and is for Wendy. So I'll just pop it in here from Nikki Truss West, who's asking, does Summer have restrictions on the types of organizations they allow to benefit from their services? For example, military applications.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the things that we, as we've begun to grow and scale, is we recognize we need to do exactly that. We need to be extremely clear for, you know, every salesperson, anybody who's doing work in this space. So we've created what we call a service line boundary policy and an ethics guild, basically. So we have red lines that we call them, that we will not cross. So we will not do military. We won't do military. We won't do you know, surveillance. We won't do work with police agencies, as an example. And there are very clear boundaries there, where we say it doesn't really matter who the company is. If they're asking us to engage in a workflow on that, we will just say no to the revenue.
Are there corporate red lines as well, that you won't do for private companies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've had a lot of this is like a board level conversation we had. So yes, like big tobacco as an example, we just won't. There are industry segments that we will just not address. But there's subject matters that I think are the other important component is like surveillance and military and weapons is another example. We also have something though that we call our gray lines, which is what are those things that could veer on the edge of harmful, and how do we take an active way in which we can evaluate it, because the world changes, right? The world changes, new data comes out, something could seem innocuous, like, oh, here's a camera to, deter burglars. Well, what if that same technology is used to profile people, right? Like that's, it may seem sort of innocuous. So that's why we created an ethics guild that includes actual annotators. So annotators, because they're the ones doing the work, labeling operations teams, product and research teams. And basically that's the team that basically does a regular assessment and says, hey, this is work that we think falls into a questionable area, so we're not going to do it. And the goal, of course, is to catch that before a lead goes into the pipeline. And it's really hard to sort of know, like 3 steps down the line, where a technology is going, but we have felt so far that this is the best way for us to be as conscious as possible. And this is our effort at it, and just trying to learn and get better, quarter by quarter.
Callum, did you want to jump in on my question just before we jump to the audience question about what, do we think we need change here, not only from a gig perspective, but for these workers, around the world, whatever geography and whether full-time or not? Do we need to see some change to rebalance the sort of power that the buyers hold in this market?
Yeah, well, I mean, Sid and Wendy have been wonderfully nuanced. I will, if people will forgive me, be very unnuanced. Yes, categorically, we need huge change. And categorically, at the moment, we're seeing this part of AI contributing to a global race to the bottom, where people are paying incredibly low wages, poverty wages, not only in the global north, but also in some cases in the global south, after fees and et cetera are taken out, for work that can be very stressful, very difficult. It's very hard to do. I mean, if you've ever worked on these platforms or watched people working on these platforms, it is very grinding, hard work that is difficult, sometimes technically complex, often incredibly boring. And right now, the biggest companies in the world are basically using these workers for incredibly cheap, and then throwing them away after. And I think absolutely categorically, yes, we need change. Yes, it is adding to a motor of inequality. But it's important when we're talking about access to work, right? That we don't just think that moving people into full-time salaried employment, as with Summer, is a panacea that solves everything. Because inequality in Western economies, for instance, has largely existed despite statutory employment and holiday and sick pay and so on and so forth. So we don't just need to get to a level of employment and then stay there. We need to supersede what we've been able to achieve in the 20th century in terms of workers' rights, in terms of the fair distribution of the fruits of this technology. What we should be looking at with AI is how can we get rid of drudgery? How can we get rid of boring work? How can we get rid of the awful things that we don't want to do? How can we free up time? Keynes used to talk about people working fewer and fewer hours, and by now we'd all be lounging around on sun lounges. That's the future we should be looking for, right? And any form of work in AI which isn't contributing to that is, traveling in the wrong direction. So I think, yes, absolutely, we need standard setting. We need an analysis of where standards are now in cloud work across the global economy. That's something that Fair Work, the project that I'm involved with at Oxford, is doing as we speak. But also we need to think in bigger terms about how can we make the gains of this technology, which are clearly so potentially huge, equally distributed, and how can we use them to undo? I mean, we've been talking about the relationship between the global south and global north. The unspoken word here is like colonialism, right? The reason these workers in the global south are being paid so little is because the legacies of violent imperialism that have structured the last 2 centuries, right? So now we have a duty as citizens of the global north, as people with some kind of control over how technology is used, to actively use that technology to undo that relationship. And not just in kind of developmentalist terms that seek fundamentally to maintain the security of an economic system which already disadvantages the poorest, but instead, to think about a grander horizon here. And if there's anything that technology can do, it is open up those horizons of what we think are possible. And I think that really is the challenge for us now.
Callum, I just wanted to ask you on that question of colonialism and that sort of differential in power. I think, Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the reasons that Sama and others have given for, keeping wages different in different parts of the world is so as to not distort local economies, especially in the areas in which you're hiring from. Callum, do you have any views on that? Do you think that digital work is digital work wherever you are and there should be a standard, or do we think that we do have to have nuances based on where people live?
I mean, as a sociologist, I've never seen a local labour market that's been destroyed by high wages. Let's put that out there. That's never been a problem. I'm aware that some are maybe unable to pay higher wages because they'd find themselves to be uncompetitive, but fundamentally, we need to be looking at systemic change to change that. It's not down to one company to suddenly pay rates that you would in the Bay Area for work in the Global South, although that is obviously would be a positive step. It might be impossible for a company with the model. But more generally, we need to be thinking about that as a political transition. And we need to be thinking about that not just in the role as private sector actors or academics or researchers, but thinking about that on the level of legislative action. And, when we're seeing currently, especially with phenomena like climate change, a doubling down of these long inherited inequalities, we need to be thinking proactively about how we reduce that over time. And that may be indeed increasing wages paid in the Global South by companies in the Global North unilaterally, but it also means empowering political actors in the Global South who can design and lead that change themselves. It doesn't have to be philanthropy from the top table, but workers and constituents and the people that live in the Global South need to design their own paths and their own solutions to this as well.
Thank you. And this is actually a related audience question, which maybe Sid, you can try and answer. Jonathan Van Dyke has asked, will attempts to solve the ghost worker problem be inconsequential unless we solve the taking advantage of cheap labor problem?
Oh boy. So I'm not sure how to answer the taking advantage of cheap labor problem. So let me give some thoughts here. I see three ways forward. One way forward is the way I think Callum is advocating, which is organizing the workers, collective bargaining, that sort of thing. Great way forward. Second way forward, changing the laws. That's great, can have a huge impact. The problem is changing laws takes time. There's actually a third way forward that very few people talk about. One of the studies I recently did was Microsoft has a program where its employees can hire Upwork workers. And we interviewed about 50 Microsoft employees who hired Upwork workers. Their number one concern was the ethics of this employee agreement. How much do I pay these people? Am I contributing to exactly the things that Callum just talked about? Am I contributing to this race to the bottom? Am I taking jobs out of my friend down the street and shipping them off overseas? All these kinds of questions came up in the Microsoft employees' minds. It was the number one problem. So people think of companies as these big monolithic evil things. I'm not saying they are, I'm not saying they're not. There's people that work in these companies and they care about the other end of this bargain. They care about the workers they're employing. So there's a power asymmetry here that the people putting the tasks on the platform have all the power. No argument there. But we can actually flip that on its head. If companies like Microsoft, other companies said to platforms, hey, we'll give you more work, but you got to help us make sure that this work is fair, I'm confident these platforms would acquiesce. So that's another way forward.
Sorry to cut you off because we've only got like a few seconds left, and I just wanted, there are two people asking the same final question, which any of you can jump in, but it's what pressures can the general public apply or members of the public to minimize impacts? Suggested actions to minimize impacts or pressures. And I think maybe they're talking about to make sure that we don't increase inequalities and that we move towards a fairer outcome for everybody. Is there anything that we outside of these companies, just, little old you and me, do about it? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Wendy?
Think of a suggestion. So the project I work on, Fair Work, we're currently putting together some initial ratings for cloud work platforms, looking at how these platforms work. And part of what Fair Work does is we have a pledge where members of the general public, institutions, employers can take that pledge that they will work with the platforms that get a higher rating, so that the more ethical their operation, you know, you're going to work with those platforms. If a platform's getting a 0, you won't work with them. And a lot of our kind of bargaining power in a discussion with a company when they're thinking about adopting more ethical measures is how many people are taking that pledge, how many people are represented. So if people are interested about getting yourself or your employer or another institution to sign up to that pledge, then, you know, going to fair.work would be a great start.
Great. Anybody else have any final thoughts on how, you know, how can we at this important moment apply pressure, create positive change so we continue to move in a direction where this is a fair way for people to do work wherever you are in the world?
I think, I mean, first of all, bravo, Callum. I think that's fantastic. That's an excellent way to present pressure. I was going to say something similar, which is vote with your dollars. And be able to, you know, I mean, that's the point of the sort of social impact criteria. We've, you know, with organizations like Partnership for AI, it's about bringing in the largest tech companies into a forum to say, this matters and we need to do things differently. So you can kind of work to have the companies organize themselves, or the public can provide a level of pressure by saying this is important, this matters to us, and to vote and make choices with your dollars. It's a very broad statement, but I think that's the most important thing we can do, which is, you know, take action by leveraging our purchasing power.
Thank you, Wendy. Sorry, Sid, did you want to have a final word
No,
as well?
I agree.
Okay,
Go
well,
for it.
I think we all agree that this type of work is only going to increase, even if it exists in changing forms. It's becoming more complex, but we're not anywhere near a situation where AI can learn, you know, train themselves and, you know, leave us all to sit on a beach. So, you know, while this work will change, and as Sid described it, you know, it will morph and evolve, but there's only going to be more of it as AI kind of infuses itself into multiple different businesses and ways in which we live and we work. And so, you know, I think we agreed that there are problems, both in the gig work model, which is much more sort of precarious, but also in a full-time work model, you know, where there are questions around wage and around conditions and around power of the worker. And Wendy, as you said, you know, the buyer still has so much power in these relationships. And so, you know, I hope that this discussion can kind of push us towards thinking about, okay, what do we want for workers today? Not 50 years in the future or necessarily, or even for when our children are grown up, because obviously those are important problems, but these workers exist today, the work is happening today, and how can we help to kind of solve those inequalities and to create a more fair, you know, job in this kind of ghost work that's done with AI. So thank you so much to Sid and to Wendy and to Callum for joining today. I learned so much. Thank you also for all our questions. We do have a couple of extras that weren't there, which I may send over to you guys. And thanks for listening.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.